So, good morning, everyone. Recently ran across this quote. It really jumped out and spoke to me, and it is, quote, anger is our ego using its outside voice shouting, things are not the way I want them. Again, anger is our ego using its outside voice shouting, things are not the way I want them. And like any shout, it echoes. It ricochets inside us long after the moment has passed. It's something we talk about here a lot. It rings in our ears, it tightens our chest, it narrows our view. And the problem with anger as an emotion is it can become addictive. It's almost like an intoxicant. Like all intoxicants, it promises freedom, freedom to get something off our chest while really taking it away. And so, from a Buddhist perspective, practical, ordinary, nothing mystical about it. Anger is simply a conditioned reaction. It's just part of the causes and conditions which so strongly influence our lives. It's what happens when our preferences, when our wishes collide with reality. When those things have a head on collision, anger usually follows. But the good news is it's really one of the most workable emotions that we have, and that's partly because it's so evident. It's so inescapable in terms of our experience of it, because it tells us exactly where we're stuck, and where our old friend the ego is holding too tightly. Which is after all this job, to alert us when we're holding too tightly. Now, as I try to do here, I want to speak with the voice I normally use when talking to you, to friends, to students. In other words, not any sort of formal, pedantic exposition on anger and ego. No sitting on high pontificating. None of this, I figured it out and you haven't, because that is certainly not the case. But just a practical view that the Dharma offers for living with everyday human life, of which anger is a part of it for all of us. But let's start with the basic assumption that anger is not evil, it's not bad, it's not a mistake. It's a signal. It's a loud, forceful, and yes, often unskillful a signal, but still a signal. It tells us, or the ego tells us, we're protecting something, we're defending against something, we're responding to something. Usually what we're protecting, it's not our physical safety so much, it's the sense of who we think we are. Back to our ego. When the ego feels threatened, when it feels not validated, when it feels that its plans are disrupted, when it feels our expectations are ignored, when our beliefs are challenged, on, it flares up. And the reason it becomes intoxicating is because that flare up feels energizing. Contrast it with a response to some harmful or upsetting event where we kind of collapse into despair. There's no power in that. There's no sense of agency in that. But with anger, it's energizing. It feels like an intoxicant because it gives us that temporary hit of power, of what we think is clarity, which really isn't. We'll come back to that. And righteousness, certainly self-righteousness. By golly, I have been wronged. And it makes us feel like we know exactly what's wrong and exactly what needs to be done. But that certainty, and this, is an illusion. It is not true, because anger narrows the mind. It doesn't create spaciousness for us to see the big picture. It puts blinders on us. It makes us believe and convinces us that the world exists solely to cooperate with our preferences. Just think about that for a moment. I mean, the world in its vastness, the weather, the people, the traffic, the clerk in the store that's taking too long, the economy, the ecosystem, all of this should obey our individual private wants. I mean, when we step back from that, we can see how ridiculous it is. But in the moment, that's what the ego believes, because it's not largely consciously articulated. And when the world doesn't obey us, when it doesn't happen, the ego raises its angry voice. And so in most ways, in many ways, maybe not 100%, the ego is the source of so much of our anger. If we trace it back, we can see that back there somewhere the ego is not happy. And from a Buddhist standpoint, the problem isn't that things aren't going our way, because they don't. The problem is the belief that they should go our way. The belief that they should go our way. They're not going to go our way, but if we believe they should, anger ensues. And the belief that things should go our way is the fuel for the anger. When we're caught in it, it's like, I love this analogy of someone yelling at the ocean for making waves. We forget that the world is moving according to its own conditions, not ours, not in deference to our wishes. The moment that we insist that life conform to our script, we've set the stage for dissatisfaction and suffering. But here's the practical side, and this is sort of a cultural thing here. We don't get rid of anger by trying to suppress it. That builds pressure, and it sometimes leads to even more anger. But we don't get rid of it by pounding a pillow either. We don't get rid of it by indulging it, because that's how it just takes on greater power. Every time we act from anger, every time we speak from anger, every time we stew in anger, we strengthen that habit of mind. We reinforce within ourselves the idea that this anger is useful, that it protects us, that it energizes and empowers us, and that it gives us something. But anger gives us one thing, and that's more anger. So the real work is learning to recognize the moment the anger starts and the source of that, catching the spark before it becomes the wildfire. And in Buddhism, as you know, this is mindfulness. This is mindfulness, not in sort of the grandiose way, but simple awareness, paying attention, noticing. We notice the cues: a tightened jaw, a heat in the chest, quickening thoughts, the impulse to lash out, contracting, all of that. And we notice it not to judge it, not to feel a shame about it, not to make it a moral problem or a failing. We notice it just so we can manage it. We can change our relationship with it. We say something like, "Oh, anger, my ego's outside voice is warming up." Remember, anger is the ego's voice. Because that awareness, that noticing, and the pause that hopefully follows it creates choices. The awareness gives us choices. Without awareness, anger is going to drive the car. With awareness, we take the wheel back. So when anger arises, we try to ask ourselves one question, the critical question: what did I want that I'm not getting right now? I wanted a sunny day and it's raining. I wanted to be on hold for 2 minutes, not 20 minutes. I wanted the traffic to move faster. I wanted you to, respect or agree with what I said. On and on and on. The question is, what did I want that I'm not getting right now? And that question alone interrupts it. It's very grounding. When I can catch it and pause and ask myself that, the whole thing opens up. And I may not have the answer right away, but at least I'm asking the right question. It takes that big self-righteous storyline out of the picture and brings me back to my human level of what are my preferences that are being unmet. And usually the answer is pretty simple. I want respect. I want things to go smoothly. I want someone to understand me. I want to feel in control. These are all natural human desires. But when we cling to them, when we squeeze them, when we treat them as entitlements, as conditions the world must meet on our behalf, we suffer. And again, the Buddha's approach to this was not to eliminate our preferences. That's not going to happen even if we wanted it to, but to hold our preferences lightly, with respect. Don't demand it. Ask for it, but don't demand it. Don't squeeze it. Don't cling to it. Because we want smooth interactions, but we don't have to collapse when they don't happen. We want to be understood, but we don't require other people to have perfect insight into understanding us. When we loosen our grip, when we open our hand, there's just less there for anger to cling to. Another practical strategy here is we shift out of our heads into our body, because anger lives in the body long after it's been a story in our mind. The story's gone, but I'm still having the stress hormones, and the activation takes a while to calm down. If we wait until the story appears, how dare they, or why's this happening to me? We're already deep into the intoxicating effects of the anger. So we need to notice the physical signs. They're going to come online pretty quickly. That's what the body does. Is our breath getting shallow? Is it tightening? Are my shoulders rising? Is there heat in my face? These are invitations. These are cues to step out of reactive mode, to break the momentum. Take one deep, purposeful, conscious breath. That's it. You don't have to sit down and do 10 minutes of meditation. You can notice it. Take that one deep, conscious breath. Ask the question of what am I not getting right now? And all of a sudden, we've changed the whole equation. That one focused breath that we actually feel, that intentional breath. The power of this moment is that it interrupts the trance of anger. Anger throws us into a trance. And the pause there, the noticing, gives us this tiny pocket of freedom to respond skillfully rather than react. Now, another thing to check in on with ourselves is whether the anger is also mixed in with some fear, because very often it is. Remember, the ego is either in self-protective mode, where there may be some fear, or self-righteous mode. We rarely explode unless something feels threatened. So we can also ask a second question. What part of me is afraid right now? What am I afraid of? Am I afraid of being devalued? Am I afraid of not mattering? Am I afraid of not getting my way? All these old scripts that come up. And these questions and these practices turn anger from what we feel like is sometimes an enemy into something more like a teacher. When we see that the fear, and when we see in the anger, it softens on its own. Now, why do we call it addictive? Because it hooks us. It gives us an adrenaline hit. It gives us that jolt of energy. And importantly, but it's an illusion, it gives us a feeling of control. And it somehow implicitly promises relief from our distress, makes us feel alive. But it ultimately leaves us with a hangover, like any intoxicant, which might be regret, which might be tension, damaged relationships, emotional fatigue, physical exhaustion, on and on. Honor promises power, but ultimately leaves us powerless. It's not a good interpersonal strategy. It doesn't win a lot of friends. It doesn't keep a lot of friends. It promises clarity, but it only creates distortion. It promises justice, but it produces harm. Now, the Buddha never said that the antidote here is passivity. He said the answer is clarity without getting intoxicated by the anger. We can set boundaries without being angry. We can speak truth without having to be angry. We can feel the sense of injustice, but we don't have to fly off the handle. We can protect ourselves and others without flying off the handle. In fact, I would argue that we do all these things better without anger driving the car, because we're not as blinded by it. The energy of anger can be transformed. It can be transformed into something more precise, more firm, more courageous. That's the alchemy of it. Okay. We take the raw heat and we temper it with awareness. We temper it with mindfulness. So let me just throw out a suggestion for the next time you feel it coming up. Delay your response. Pause for 5 or 10 seconds. Just just before you open your mouth, before you say anything or do anything, just take that pause. It's not to suppress it, but to give ourselves space to see what is actually happening. Because those 10 seconds will represent a little crack in the wall of the ego. And through that crack, light gets in. Okay. Remember that Leonard Cohen, it's the cracks in all of us is where the light gets in. And then we reflect after the fact. When we calm down, we reflect on the situation, not in a judging, harsh way. What expectation was violated? Was it reasonable? Was it absolute, my expectation? What was the anger trying to accomplish for me? Did it help? Did it work? Or did it hurt? Not in a self-critical way, but in a learning, teachable way. Anger becomes a teacher when we examine it with honesty and without shame. One of the most liberating realizations on this path is that we are not at the mercy of our emotions. We don't have to be pushed and pulled by every frustration. There is within us a deeper stability available. But it's not something we acquire, it's something we uncover. It's already there. We have to uncover it every time we choose awareness over reactivity. Every time we choose awareness over reactivity. Anger's going to arise. We're going to get triggered. We're human. But when we see the anger as our ego shouting, we can choose not to shout back. We can let the echo fade. We can remind ourselves that reality is not obligated, and nor will it match our preferences. And when we accept that, even for a moment, a space opens up. I know this firsthand because it's something I've really worked with in my own life. It's powerful. In that space, compassion naturally appears. Not the soft, sentimental kind, but clear-eyed compassion. The kind that sees the difficulty of this human journey, sees the challenges, both for ourselves and for others. Yes, anger is the ego's outside voice. But our Buddhist path gives us tools to lower the volume, to listening instead of shouting. And there again, we once again discover that ego isn't the enemy. It's just scared. It's just overreacting. It's just thinks it has to protect itself. But when we meet it with awareness, the shouting of the ego quiets. The intoxicating nature of it loses its pull. What remains is clarity, steadiness, and the freedom to move through the world while being less driven by the fire of our own emotions and reactions. That's the practical path of the Dharma. Never perfection, not suppression, just awareness, honesty, and a willingness to let the world be what it is without our being able to control it, even when it doesn't follow our script. So those are some thoughts this morning on anger is the ego shouting. Let me stop this. Here we go.